The tin star on the windowsill caught the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, but Silas couldn't stop staring at the dried mud caked on the heels of her traveling boots. They were good boots, quality leather, but those boots had walked through rough country to get here. He wondered what else they'd walked through. Her name was Clara Mayfield, and she'd stepped off the stagecoach from St. Louis not 2 hours ago. The marriage arrangement had been made through letters over 4 long months, and now here she was, standing in his cabin with her carpetbag clutched in both hands like it held all her secrets. Silas wiped his palms on his trousers for the 3rd time since she'd arrived. "You can set that down anywhere," he said, nodding toward the small table by the window. "It ain't much, I know. But the roof don't leak and the stove draws good." Clara looked around the single room with eyes that missed nothing. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 22, with dark hair pinned up beneath a travel-worn bonnet. Her dress was simple calico, faded but clean, and her fingers when she finally set down the bag were rough with callus. City women didn't have hands like that. "It's fine," she said quietly. "It's more than I had." That caught his attention. In her letters, she'd spoken of a comfortable life helping her aunt run a boarding house. But boarding house keepers didn't have hands worn from hard work, and they didn't look at a stranger's cabin like it was a palace. Silas had built this place himself 3 years back, when he'd first come to the Montana Territory looking for a fresh start. It sat in a shallow valley about 4 miles outside of Bitterroot Springs, close enough to town for supplies but far enough to be alone. That aloneness had suited him fine. Until lately. Lately, the silence had started to feel less like peace and more like hiding. "I made coffee," he said, moving toward the stove. "Probably boiled it to death. I'm better with cattle than I am with cooking." Clara almost smiled at that. Almost. Cattle. Your letters said you had a small herd. 43 head. Over in the north pasture. Nothing like the big ranches, but enough to keep a man busy. He poured the coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. Their fingers didn't touch, but he noticed how carefully she took it, like she was measuring the distance between them. She carried the cup to the window and stood looking out at the late summer light falling over the hills. The tin star on the sill caught her attention. She picked it up, turned it over in those calloused fingers. "What's this?" Silas felt something tighten in his chest. Old badge. From before. Before Montana. Before a lot of things. She set it back down carefully, exactly where it had been. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She didn't open it, just held it while she sipped her coffee, but he caught her glancing at it. Checking it. Like she was making sure it was still there. "You keep checking that paper," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Family picture." She didn't answer right away. Outside, a meadowlark called across the valley. The sun was dropping lower now, painting the hills in gold. "Something like that," she finally said. Silas let it go. They were strangers, after all. You couldn't expect a person to share everything in the first hour. He busied himself straightening things that didn't need straightening, suddenly aware of how small the cabin was, how close together they'd be living. The bed in the corner. The single chair. The way the whole world narrowed down to this one room and this one woman. "The stage was late," he said, filling the silence. "I was starting to worry. Roads were muddy near the pass. We had to wait while they cleared a slide. That'll happen this time of year. September in the mountains, you never know what you're going to get." She nodded, still looking out the window. Still holding that paper. "I should fetch more water before dark," Silas said, grateful for something to do. "There's a bucket by the door. You make yourself at home." He grabbed the pail and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The evening air smelled like pine and dry grass, clean and honest. He stood there a moment, just breathing, trying to settle the nervous flutter in his stomach. She seemed nice enough. Quiet. But that wasn't a fault. Pretty, in a way that made him nervous. And those eyes, they'd seen things. He recognized that because he'd seen things too. The well was around the side of the cabin, a good 50 feet from the door. He walked slow, giving himself time. The bucket splashed down, and he worked the rope, letting the cool water fill it. When he turned back, pail heavy in his hand, he noticed something through the window. Clara had moved. She was standing by his bed, where his old leather vest hung on a peg. And she was holding something. A paper. That paper. But now it was open. Silas stopped walking. Something cold that had nothing to do with the well water settled in his stomach. Through the glass, he watched her look from the paper to the vest and back again. Watched her shoulders go rigid. Watched her hand rise to her mouth. He took a step forward, then another. His boots felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. She turned then, and even from outside, through the dirty window, he could see her face had gone white as bone. The paper fluttered from her fingers, drifting down to land on the floorboards. Her eyes found him through the glass, and in them he saw something that made his blood run cold. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. The bucket slipped from his hand. Water splashed his boots, soaked into the dry ground. He didn't feel it. He was too busy watching Clara back away from him inside the cabin. One hand pressed against her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from pounding right out of her body. Then she looked down at the floor, at something near her feet. The tin star. It must have been knocked from the windowsill when she moved. It lay there in the fading light, tiny and silver and damning. Silas didn't know what was on that paper, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent 3 years running from his past, that his running had just come to an end. The clatter of that little star hitting the floor sounded louder than any gunshot. The water from the dropped pail had soaked clean through his boots, but Silas couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except the pounding of his own heart as he watched Clara through that dusty window. She was backing away from the fallen tin star like it was a snake about to strike. His hand moved without thinking, reaching for the spot under his shirt where the scar ran along his ribs. 3 years old, that scar. 3 years since Abilene. 3 years since everything went wrong. Silas forced his feet to move. One step. Another. The cabin door loomed ahead, and he pushed it open slowly, the way you'd approach a spooked horse. The hinges creaked and Clara flinched, pressing herself against the far wall. Her eyes were wide, scanning him, measuring, calculating. "Don't," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Silas stopped just inside the doorway. He raised his empty hands, palms open. "I ain't gonna hurt you." "You're him." It wasn't a question. "You're the ghost." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 3 years. Had hoped he'd never hear it again. The ghost of the Gulch. That's what the newspapers had called him after the Abilene bank job. The one who got away. The one nobody could identify. "I'm Silas," he said quietly. "Silas Hawking. That's who I am now." Clara's breath came in short gasps. She was looking at the vest on the peg, then at his face, then at the wanted poster on the floor. The afternoon light was almost gone now, leaving the cabin in grey shadows. Silas could see the shape of her hand pressed against the rough wall, fingers spread like she needed something solid to hold onto. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I didn't know. Not for sure." Her voice trembled. I had to find you. I had to find whoever was there." The words didn't make sense. Silas frowned, taking a half step forward. Clara tensed and he stopped again. "Whoever was where?" he asked. "Clara, what's this about?" She pointed at the floor, at the fallen paper. "Pick it up. You need to see." Silas knelt slowly, keeping his movements easy to read. His knees popped in the quiet room. He picked up the wanted poster and held it toward what was left of the light. There he was, or at least a sketch that looked enough like him to be dangerous. The reward was $500. $500 for a man who'd stood lookout outside a bank while men he trusted went inside and did things he'd never forgive himself for. But there was something else. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed Clara wasn't looking at his poster anymore. She was reaching into her sleeve, pulling out another paper. Smaller. Older. The edges were soft and worn from folding. She held it out and he took it. The face staring back at him was young. Maybe 19, 20. Kind eyes, gentle smile. Nothing like the hard men Silas had ridden with. Nothing like the faces he saw in his nightmares. Above the sketch, in bold letters, it said, "Wanted for murder." Below, a name, Thomas Mayfield. Silas looked up at Clara. Her face was wet now, tears cutting tracks through the dust from her travels. "That's my brother," she whispered. "He worked at that bank. He was a teller. He was 18 years old and he'd never hurt anybody in his whole life." The room tilted. Silas gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Thomas Mayfield. The teller. The one Preacher Pike had shot when things went wrong. The one whose death had turned a robbery into murder and sent Silas running for the hills. "He wasn't the killer," Silas said. The words came out rough. "Clara, your brother wasn't." "I know he wasn't." Her voice rose, cracking with emotion. "I know. But that's what they called him after. They said he must have been in on it. They said he pulled a gun. They lied. The newspaper lied. The sheriff lied. Everybody lied because the real killer got away and they needed someone to blame." Silas stared at the poster in his hands, at the young face, at the word murder stamped across it like a brand. "I came to Montana because your letters stopped," Clara said. "My aunt's boarding house failed. I had nothing left. And then I found this." She touched the wanted poster of Silas, still on the floor. "I found it in an old sheriff's office when they were cleaning out files. The date matched. The place matched. And I remembered your letters. I remembered you said you'd come from somewhere else, that you'd started fresh in Montana. And I thought maybe I was the one who killed him." Clara nodded, the motion small and broken. "I told myself I was coming for justice. I told myself I'd find the man responsible and make him pay. But the closer I got, the more I read your letters again, the more I started hoping you weren't that man. Because your letters were kind, Silas. They were gentle. And gentlemen don't shoot bank tellers." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the first crickets of evening had started singing. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Silas set both posters on the table. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavy, like a man twice his age. "I was there," he said. "I won't lie to you about that. I was the lookout. I was supposed to watch for the sheriff while they cleaned out the vault." Clara didn't move from the wall, didn't speak. "But I didn't go in. I never went inside. And when I heard the shot, when I saw Preacher Pike come running out with blood on his hands, I ran too. I ran because I was a coward. I ran because I knew if I stayed, I'd hang alongside him. And I've been running ever since." Preacher Pike. Clara said the name like it was poison. "That's who did it. Tall man. Black hat. Always smiling like he knew a joke you didn't." Silas rubbed his face with both hands. "He's the one. He's been running too, far as I know. Probably changed his name, changed his look. But I'd know him anywhere." Clara pushed off from the wall. She walked to the table, slow and careful, and sat in the other chair. For a long moment, she just looked at her brother's wanted poster. Then she looked at Silas. "You didn't kill him." "No. You didn't pull the trigger." "No. But I was part of it. I helped plan it. I stood watch. If I'd been braver, if I'd stopped them, or warned someone, or—" "Stop." Her voice was quiet but firm. "My brother is dead because of a man with a gun and a smile. Not because of you." Silas didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent 3 years carrying the weight of that day. 3 years telling himself he was as guilty as Pike. And now this woman, this stranger who'd come hunting him, was telling him different. The tin star still lay on the floor where it had fallen. Clara leaned down and picked it up. She turned it over in her fingers, the way she had earlier, but now her touch was different. Softer. "You wore this before, she said. Before everything. Texas. I was a deputy in a little town called Morningstar. 3 years before Abilene. What happened? Silas shook his head. Long story. The short version is, I learned that wearing a star don't make you a good man, and not wearing one don't make you bad. Clara set the star on the table between them. It caught the last ray of light coming through the window, glinting gold for just a moment before the sun finally slipped below the horizon. I came here to find a killer, she said. I think maybe I did. Just not the one I expected. The darkness settled over the cabin. Neither of them moved to light a lamp. 3 days. 72 hours of silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. 3 days of Clara sleeping in a single bed while Silas took the floor by the stove, his back against the warm iron and his eyes on the door. 3 days of her clutching that small knife under her pillow, and him pretending not to notice. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas wound the clock on the mantel. It was a habit, that winding. Something his mother had taught him as a boy back in Ohio. A man who keeps time, she used to say, keeps his word. He wondered what she'd think of him now, winding a clock in a cabin he'd built to hide in, sharing space with a woman who'd come to trap him. The trap. That's what this was, wasn't it? He'd figured it out sometime during the second night, staring at the ceiling while Clara's breathing evened out into sleep. She hadn't just stumbled onto him. She'd planned this. The letters, the marriage arrangement, the long journey west, it was all bait. And he'd swallowed it like a starving fish. But here's the thing about traps. Sometimes the person setting them gets caught too. Clara appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her hair loose around her shoulders, holding a tin cup of coffee. She'd stopped flinching every time he moved. Stopped backing against walls. This morning, she even sat in the other chair at the table, across from him, like regular people sharing breakfast. The meadowlarks woke me, she said. I'm not used to birds being so loud. They're saying good morning, Silas replied. That's all. She almost smiled. Almost. You always find the kind explanation for things. I try. He sipped his coffee. It was bitter, but he'd learned to like it that way. Makes the world easier to live in. Clara looked out the window at the hills rolling golden in the early light. My brother used to say that. He'd find the good in everything. Even when things were bad, he'd say, Clara, look at the sky. It's still blue. That's something. Silas set his cup down carefully. Tell me about him. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, soft and slow, she started talking. About Thomas. About how he'd saved his wages for a year to buy her a proper winter coat. About how he'd sing old hymns while he worked, off-key but happy. About how he'd gotten the bank job just 2 months before everything happened, and how proud he'd been to walk into that building every morning in a clean shirt and a tie. He wrote me letters too, Clara said. Every week. He told me about the people who came in, the farmers depositing their harvest money, the old ladies cashing their pensions. He said it was the first job that made him feel like a real man. Silas felt the weight of those words settle on his chest. A real man. Thomas Mayfield had been becoming a real man while Silas was falling in with Pike and his crew, drawn by easy money and the promise of belonging somewhere. I should have been there, Silas whispered. You were there. That's the problem. No. I mean, I should have been there to stop it. I should have seen what Pike was. I should have walked away before we even reached Abilene. Clara studied him across the table. Why didn't you? The question hung in the air between them. Silas stared into his coffee cup like it held answers. Because I was lonely, he finally said. Because I'd spent 3 years as a deputy in a town that didn't want me anymore. Because Pike smiled at me and said I looked like a man who needed a second chance. And I was stupid enough to believe him. The clock ticked on the mantel. 5 minutes passed. 10. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand. Just barely. Just fingertips. You're not stupid, Silas. You're just human. That touch undid something in him. 3 years of running, 3 years of looking over his shoulder, 3 years of telling himself he was a monster, and this woman, this stranger who'd come to destroy him, was offering kindness instead. He pulled his hand away. Not because he didn't want her touch, but because he didn't deserve it. "I need to check the herd," he said, standing so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "They've been down by the creek. I should make sure they're okay." Clara nodded, understanding that he needed space. "I'll be here." He grabbed his hat and headed for the door, but something made him pause. A flicker of movement on the ridge to the east. He squinted against the morning sun, raising a hand to shield his eyes. A rider. Too far to make out details, but the shape was clear against the sky. Black hat. Dark clothes. Sitting still as stone, watching the cabin. Silas's blood turned to ice. "Clara," he said, his voice low and tight. "Get inside. Now." She was at his side in an instant, following his gaze. "Who is it?" "I don't know yet. But I've got a feeling." They stood together in the doorway, watching the rider. He didn't move. Didn't wave. Just sat there on that ridge, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky, like a vulture waiting for something to die. "Could be anybody," Clara said, but her voice shook. "Could be." Silas stepped back inside and reached for the rifle hanging over the door. "Or could be exactly who we've been hiding from." The rest of the day passed in a blur of watchfulness. Silas moved between the windows, keeping low, watching that ridge. The rider stayed until noon, then disappeared. An hour later, he was back on a different ridge, closer this time. Testing. Probing. By nightfall, Silas knew. That posture, that stillness, he'd seen it before. In Abilene. In the moments before everything went wrong. "Pike," he said, the name bitter on his tongue. "It's him." Clara sat by the cold stove, her arms wrapped around herself. How did he find us?" Silas thought back. The wanted poster she'd carried. The question she'd asked in town, probably. Pike had always had people watching, people who'd pass along information for a price. If Clara had been asking about the ghost of the Gulch, word would have reached him eventually. "He didn't find us," Silas realized. "He found you. Following you. Waiting to see if you'd lead him to me." Clara's face went pale. "I led him here. I brought him to your door." "No." Silas knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "You brought him to our door. And that changes things. For the better. For the honest." He looked into her eyes, really looked, for the first time since she'd arrived. "I've been running for 3 years, Clara. Running from Pike, running from what I did, running from myself. I'm tired of running. What else can we do?" Silas stood and walked to the window. On the far ridge, a tiny orange glow appeared, a campfire. Pike was settling in for the night, confident, patient, waiting. "We can stop hiding," Silas said. "We can face him together. But I need to know, are you with me? Not because you came here to trap a killer. Because you choose to be. Here. With me." The silence stretched. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, an owl called. Clara rose and walked to stand beside him at the window. She slipped her hand into his, and this time, he didn't pull away. "I've been running too," she whispered. "Running from grief. Running from anger. Running from the truth that Thomas is gone and no amount of revenge will bring him back." She squeezed his fingers. "I'm done running, Silas. I'm with you." They stood together in the darkness, watching that distant fire, and Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Not dread. Purpose. And then he realized the lie he'd been telling himself all along, that he was a coward, that running was all he knew, that he'd never be the man he once was. But standing here, with Clara's hand in his, facing the devil from his past, he knew the truth. He wasn't the ghost of the Gulch anymore. He was Silas Hawking. And Silas Hawking had something worth fighting for. The tin star felt heavier than Silas remembered. He turned it over in his fingers, watching the firelight dance across its surface, and thought about the last time he'd pinned it to his chest. Morning Star, Texas. Population 211. A lifetime ago. Clara watched him from across the cabin, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she hadn't touched in an hour. Outside, the first grey light of dawn was creeping over the hills. Pike's fire had burned down to embers on the ridge, but they both knew he was still there. Waiting. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked quietly. Silas looked up from the star. "I'm thinking about my daddy. He was a farmer in Ohio. Corn and wheat. Never hurt nobody in his life." He paused, running his thumb along the edge of the metal. He used to say that being brave ain't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. That sounds like a good man. He was. Silas stood up, crossed to the table, and set the star down in front of her. "I want you to have this." Clara's eyes widened. "Silas, I can't." "You can. You will." He knelt beside her chair, so they were eye to eye. "I've been carrying this thing for 10 years, and you know what I've learned? It's just metal. The star don't make the man. The man makes the star." "But what about you? What about after?" "I don't know what happens after. Nobody does." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "What I do know is that I spent 3 years hiding from who I used to be, and in 3 days, you showed me who I could become." Clara picked up the star. It was warm from his hand. "I came here to trap you, to use you as bait. How can you trust me after that?" "Because you stayed." Silas smiled, small and sad. "Because when you could have run, you stayed. Because when I told you the truth about Abilene, you didn't look at me like a monster. You looked at me like a man." The cabin filled with the sounds of morning. Birds waking, wind stirring the dry grass, and underneath it all, the knowledge that somewhere out there, a killer was stirring too. "Here's what we are going to do," Silas said, standing and moving to the window. "Pike knows this cabin. He's been watching it for 2 days. He knows there's only one door, 2 windows, and nowhere to run. So we run. No, we make him come to us." Silas pointed toward the north. "There's an old mine shaft about half a mile that way. I've been using it as a root cellar. It's dark, it's cold, and it's the last place anyone would look for a fight." Clara joined him at the window, following his gaze. "You want to lead him there?" "I want you to lead him there." Silas turned to face her. "You're going to walk out that door in 1 hour. You're going to act scared, confused, like you don't know what to do. Pike will show himself. He'll think you're running, that you've given up on me. And he'll follow. While you circle around. While I circle around." Silas nodded. "There's only one way in and out of that shaft. If I can get behind him, if I can block the entrance, he'll have nowhere to go." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she set the tin star on the table, rose on her toes, and kissed his cheek. "Don't you miss this time, Silas." "I won't. I mean it. Don't you dare miss. Because I didn't come all this way to lose you now." He caught her hand, pressed it to his heart so she could feel it beating. "Feel that? That's yours now. I'm not letting anything take it away." 1 hour later, Clara walked out the cabin door. The morning air hit her face, cool and clean. She left the door hanging open behind her, a sign of hurry, of panic. She walked fast but not too fast, her boots kicking up dust on the path that led north. Every nerve in her body screamed to look back, to check the ridges, to see if he was there. But she kept her eyes forward, just like Silas had told her. 50 yards. 100. The path curved around a stand of pine trees, and for a moment she was hidden from the cabin. She paused there, catching her breath, and that's when she heard it. Hooves. Slow. deliberate, coming from the east. Clara forced herself to keep walking. The mine shaft was close now. She could see the dark opening ahead, half hidden by brush. Behind her, the hooves stopped. Then a voice, smooth as oil, called out, "Morning, miss." Clara turned. The man on the horse was tall, all sharp angles and easy smiles. Black hat pulled low, black vest over a white shirt. He looked like he'd just stepped out of a church social, except for his eyes. Those eyes were dead and empty as a winter sky. "Who are you?" Clara's voice shook, and she didn't have to fake it. "Name's Pike. Preacher Pike, some folks call me." He tipped his hat, polite as you please. "I'm looking for a friend of mine. Man named Silas. You seen him?" Clara shook her head, backing toward the mine shaft. "I don't know anyone named Silas. I'm just passing through." Pike smiled, and it was the worst thing Clara had ever seen. "Now, that's funny, because I've been watching that cabin for 2 days, and you sure look settled in. Cooking, sleeping, keeping company." He dismounted, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. "So here's what I think. I think you know exactly who Silas is, and I think you're going to take me to him." Clara took another step back. The mine shaft opening was right behind her now, dark and cold. "He's not here. He left. Last night. He knew you were coming." Pike laughed. It was a pleasant sound, warm and friendly, and it made Clara's skin crawl. "Left? The ghost? That coward's been running for 3 years. He ain't about to stop now." He took a step toward her. "But you know what? I believe you. I believe he ran. And I believe you're going to tell me which direction." He went west, toward the mountains. Pike studied her, those dead eyes searching her face. "You're lying." "I'm not." "You are." He sighed, like a disappointed father. "And that's a shame, because I was hoping we could do this easy." He reached for the gun at his hip. Clara didn't wait. She turned and ran into the mine shaft, plunging into darkness so complete it felt like drowning. Behind her, she heard Pike curse, heard his boots pounding the earth as he chased her in. The shaft went back about 50 feet, then opened into a small chamber Silas had cleared for storage. Clara pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard, listening to Pike's footsteps echo in the narrow space. "Little lady." His voice bounced off the stone walls. "This is foolish. You come on out now, and I promise I'll make it quick." Clara held her breath. Pike's footsteps came closer. She could see his silhouette now, framed against the light from the entrance. He was big, bigger than she'd realized, filling the tunnel as he moved toward her. "That's far enough." The voice came from behind Pike. From the entrance. Silas stepped out of the shadows, rifle raised, blocking the only way out. Pike stopped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Pike laughed again, that same pleasant laugh. "Well now, the ghost returns." He spread his arms wide, inviting. 3 years, Silas. 3 years I've been looking for you. And here you are, hiding in a hole with a woman. Drop the gun, Pike. Or what? You'll shoot me. Pike shook his head, smiling. "We both know you don't have it in you. You never did. That's why you were lookout. That's why you ran. You're not a killer, Silas. You never were." Silas felt the words at home, felt the old doubts creeping back. Pike knew him, knew exactly where to push. But then Clara stepped out of the shadows behind Pike, and Silas saw the tin star gleaming in her hand. She didn't say a word, just held it up where he could see, a reminder of what he'd told her. Being brave ain't about not being scared. "You're right," Silas said, his voice steady. "I'm not a killer, but I'm not a coward anymore either." He cocked the rifle. "Last chance, Pike. Drop it." Pike's smile finally faded. His eyes went hard, calculating. For a heartbeat, Silas thought he might actually surrender. Then Pike moved, spinning toward Clara, reaching for her with one hand while the other brought up his gun. And Silas squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot echoed through the mine shaft like thunder in a bottle. For one terrible second, everything was smoke and sound and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Then the echoes faded, and silence rushed in to fill the empty space. Pike stood frozen, his hand inches from Clara's arm. His gun had clattered to the stone floor. Very slowly, he looked down at himself, then back at Silas. Surprise flickered across his face, there and gone like a candle in the wind. "You missed," he whispered. Then his knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground. Clara stumbled backward, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. Her breath came in short gasps, each one louder than the last in the sudden quiet. Pike lay motionless between her and the entrance, a dark shape on the darker floor. Silas lowered the rifle. His hands were shaking now, the way they always did after, the way they had in Abilene when he'd run instead of stayed. But this time was different. This time he hadn't run. This time he'd stood his ground. "Clara." His voice came out rough. "Clara, are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Her eyes were fixed on Pike, on the stillness of him, on the way the light from the entrance caught the silver buckle of his belt and made it gleam. Silas moved forward, stepping around the body, never taking his eyes off it until he reached Clara's side. He took her hand, felt how cold it was, how tightly her fingers gripped his. "It's over," he said. "It's done." They stood like that for a long time, two people in the dark, holding onto each other like the only solid things in a world that had just tilted sideways. Outside, the sun continued its slow climb over the Montana hills. Inside, something had ended and something else had begun. 6 weeks later, the first frost painted the valley white. Silas stood at the cabin window, a tin cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the sun rise over hills that looked dusted with powdered sugar. The air through the glass was sharp and clean, carrying the promise of winter. He'd always loved this time of year, the way the world slowed down, the way everything got quiet and still. Behind him, Clara hummed softly while she worked. A simple tune, one of those old hymns Thomas used to sing. She'd taken to humming it while she went about her morning chores, and Silas had come to love the sound of it. It meant she was home. It meant she was happy. He turned to watch her. She was sitting by the fire, wearing his old leather vest over her dress, a needle and thread in her hands. The vest had torn during all the commotion of that day, a long rip along the sleeve that needed mending. Clara had insisted on fixing it proper, not just patching it but reinforcing the whole arm with careful, tiny stitches. "That's coming along nice," Silas said. Clara looked up and smiled. Really smiled, the kind that reached her eyes and made her whole face glow. "Almost done. Just a few more minutes." He crossed the room and sat in the other chair, close enough to see her work. The fire crackled and popped, chasing away the morning chill. On the mantel, the clock ticked steady and sure, keeping time the way his mother had taught him. The tin star sat beside the clock, polished now, gleaming in the firelight. Silas looked at it and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not pride, exactly. Not sadness either. Maybe just peace. "I've been thinking," Clara said, not looking up from her stitching, "about Thomas." "What about him?" She paused, considering her words. "I used to think about him every minute of every day. The way he laughed. The way he sang off key. The way he'd save his wages to buy me things I didn't need." She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "After he died, those memories hurt so bad I couldn't breathe. I thought if I could just find who did it, if I could just make someone pay, the hurting would stop." "Did it?" Silas asked quietly. "Stop." Clara thought about it. The needle moved through the leather, in and out, in and out. No, but something else happened instead. She looked up at him. The hurting got smaller, and other things got bigger. Like this. She gestured at the cabin, at the fire, at him. "Like us." Silas reached across and touched her hand. I know what you mean. I spent 3 years running from what I did in Abilene. 3 years telling myself I was a coward, a failure, a man who didn't deserve a second chance. He smiled, small and real. Then you showed up with that wanted poster, and everything changed. I'm sorry about that. Don't be. He squeezed her fingers. That poster brought you here. And you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Clara set down her needle and thread. She held up the vest, turning it this way and that, examining her work. The rip was gone, replaced by neat, careful stitching that would hold for years. There, she said. Good as new. Better, actually. It's reinforced now. Stronger than before. Silas took the vest and ran his fingers over the mended sleeve. The leather was soft and worn, comfortable as an old friend. But the stitching was new, fresh, a sign that something broken had been made whole again. Stronger than before, he repeated. I like that. He stood and put the vest on, settling it over his shoulders like it belonged there. Because it did. Because he belonged here now, in this cabin, with this woman, in this life he'd built from the ashes of the old one. Clara stood too, brushing dust from her skirt. I should start breakfast. The eggs won't wait forever. I'll get more wood. Silas headed for the door, then paused. He looked back at her, at the firelight playing over her face, at the tin star gleaming on the mantel, at the mended sleeve on his arm. Clara. Yes. Thank you. For staying. She crossed the room and kissed him, soft and sweet. Thank you for letting me. Outside, the frost crunched under Silas's boots as he walked to the woodpile. The air was cold enough to see his breath, cold enough to make his cheeks tingle. He stacked logs in his arms, working steady and slow, the way a man works when he's not in a hurry to be anywhere else. From inside the cabin, he heard Clara start humming again. That same hymn. It drifted through the walls and mixed with the morning sounds, the birds, and the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Silas paused and looked back at the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, straight and true. Light glowed through the windows. Somewhere in there, a woman was making breakfast and humming hymns, waiting for him to come back inside. He thought about the wanted posters, burned to ash in the hearth weeks ago. He thought about Pike, buried in an unmarked grave out past the mine shaft where nobody would ever find him. He thought about Thomas Mayfield, finally at rest, finally remembered the way he deserved to be remembered, not as a wanted man, but as a brother who sang off key and bought his sister wintercoats. The past was still there. It would always be there. But it didn't own him anymore. Silas hefted the wood and walked back toward the cabin. Toward the warmth. Toward the humming. Toward the woman who'd come hunting a ghost and found a man instead. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, letting the cold air in for just a moment before closing it behind him. Clara looked up from the stove and smiled. Perfect timing, she said. Eggs are almost ready. Silas set the wood by the fire and took his seat at the table. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. The eggs sizzled in the pan. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Silas Hawking felt like he was exactly where he belonged.